Hey Reddit, I wasn't sure if I should post this here, but I need to get it off my chest. It's one of those if I don't tell someone, it'll eat me alive kind of things. My family and I went through something a few months ago, something I still can't explain. I can't prove it either, which makes it even harder to talk about. But if you've got time to read, I'll try to tell it straight. It all started when we moved out of the city. My wife, Claire, and I had been grinding ourselves into dust for years. Me at a tech job I hated, her juggling freelance gigs while trying to keep our kids, Josh and Ellie, from turning into little screen zombies. It wasn't working. The noise, the stress, the arguments about nothing and everything. It was suffocating us. When Claire's uncle offered us his old cabin in Maine, it felt like the universe throwing us a lifeline. A fresh start, Claire called it. Somewhere quiet where we could breathe again. The cabin was tucked in a stretch of woods known as Whispering Pines, about a half-hour's drive from the nearest town. I liked the sound of it. Remote, but not too remote. I figured I could work remotely while Claire homeschooled the kids. What could go wrong? The day we arrived, the forest was imposing. It wasn't like the kind of woods you see in a nature documentary, all sunny glades and chirping birds. This place was dense and dark, the kind of forest that feels alive when the wind moves through it. The pines were so tall they blocked out most of the sky, and their trunks were packed tightly, like soldiers on watch. The cabin itself was straight out of a Pinterest board for rustic charm, which is a polite way of saying it was old and kind of creepy. 2 stories, a wraparound porch, and an attic that I decided not to mention to the kids just yet, mostly because the door to it wouldn't budge. There was no internet, barely any cell service, and electricity ran on a generator. But we told ourselves it would be good for us. Simplify. Unplug. That first night, I couldn't sleep. Claire and the kids were out cold, but I kept hearing noises. It wasn't anything obvious, like footsteps or doors creaking. More like the soft rustle of leaves, except there was no wind. Every now and then, there was a faint tapping sound on the window nearest our bed. I checked it twice, but there was nothing outside but darkness and the faint outline of the pines swaying against the moonlight. I told myself it was just my nerves. City brain, still wired for the hum of traffic and the glow of streetlights. It's just the woods, I whispered to myself. Nothing out there but trees and squirrels. I didn't sleep much. The next morning, we drove into the nearby town, Elders Hollow, to stock up on groceries and introduce ourselves to the locals. I wish I could say they were warm and welcoming, but no. The minute I mentioned Whispering Pines, the vibe shifted. People stopped smiling. Conversations turned short. One older guy at the gas station outright warned me, "That forest doesn't like outsiders." "Excuse me?" I asked, caught off guard. He shrugged, avoiding eye contact. "Just don't go wandering too far in. Keep to the main paths. And don't let the kids climb the trees." Claire laughed it off when I told her, calling it small-town superstition. "They probably just want to scare the city slickers," she said, rolling her eyes. I nodded, but something about the guy's tone stuck with me. He didn't sound like he was trying to scare me. He sounded scared himself. The second night, the weirdness ramped up. After dinner, Ellie ran to me, clutching a bundle of sticks she'd found in the yard. "Look, Daddy, a star." Sure enough, the sticks were tied together in a rough star shape with what looked like twine. "Where did you find this?" I asked. She pointed toward the edge of the forest. "It was on the ground. There's a bunch of them." I took the star from her and went to investigate. Sure enough, there were more. Half a dozen stick stars scattered around the yard, some propped up against tree trunks, others lying in the grass. They weren't haphazard. They'd been deliberately placed. "Probably some neighborhood kids playing pranks," Claire said when I showed her. "Relax, it's nothing." "Neighborhood kids?" I said. "The nearest house is like 5 miles away." But what else could it be? I left the stars where they were and tried not to think about them. That night, the whispers started. It was subtle at first, almost like a breeze passing through the trees. But as the hours dragged on, the sound grew sharper, more distinct. It was like voices, low, fragmented words just on the edge of hearing. I sat up in bed, straining to make sense of it, but the moment I focused, it seemed to fade, like a dream slipping away when you wake. And then there were the footprints. The next morning, when I stepped outside to grab some firewood, I saw them in the snow. A trail of prints leading from the edge of the forest to our porch. The thing is, they weren't boot prints. They were bare. Human, but too long. The toes slightly curled, almost claw-like. And they stopped at the porch. No return trail. What the hell? I muttered, my breath clouding the air. I called Claire outside, but by the time she got there, the sun had melted the snow, and the prints were gone. She gave me a look like I was losing it. You sure you're not just overtired? Yeah, I said, but I didn't believe it. Something was wrong with this place. I could feel it in my bones. All right, so where was I? Right, the footprints. The bare, claw-like ones that stopped at the porch. That was the first moment I felt something I couldn't brush off. But of course, Claire thought I was overreacting, and honestly, I wanted her to be right. I told myself it was just some animal, maybe a trick of the light, and tried to let it go. Spoiler, I couldn't. The day after the footprints, we stayed around the cabin to get some projects done. Claire was scrubbing down the kitchen while I chopped firewood, and the kids were playing outside. I kept an eye on them while I worked, especially Ellie. She was only 7, and her curiosity was as boundless as her sense of danger was non-existent. At one point, I looked up and couldn't see her anywhere. Ellie, I called. No answer. My stomach dropped. I abandoned the axe and ran toward the woods, yelling her name. Just as I reached the tree line, I saw her. She was standing a few yards in, staring up at one of the trees. What are you doing? I asked, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. She turned to me, her face pale. Daddy, look. I followed her gaze to the tree and felt a chill run down my spine. At first, I didn't see what she was pointing at, just bark and branches. But then I saw it, a face. Not a real one, but the shape of a face, subtly carved into the trunk. It was so faint I might have missed it if Ellie hadn't pointed it out. It wasn't like those happy, old man faces you see in tree sculptures at parks. This one was twisted, almost angry, with hollow eyes and an open mouth that seemed to be frozen mid-scream. It didn't look human, not really. The proportions were all wrong. Okay, I said, scooping Ellie up and backing away. Let's head inside. But there's more, she protested, squirming in my arms. There's faces on all the trees. I didn't stick around to confirm it. I hustled her back to the cabin, my heart pounding the whole way. That night, I told Claire about it. She frowned but didn't say anything right away, which was worse than if she laughed it off. Finally, she said, maybe they're old carvings? Left over from whoever lived here before? Maybe, I said, but we both knew that was a reach. It didn't explain why Ellie was so spooked. The following morning, we made a second trip into Elder's Hollow. I decided to ask around about the carvings, the stick stars, and, if I didn't feel like a total lunatic, the footprints. Claire said I was being paranoid, but she humored me and came along. This time, I stopped by the diner, figuring it'd be a good place to chat up locals. It was the kind of place with vinyl booths and laminated menus, the air thick with the smell of bacon grease and coffee. I approached the waitress, a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and a name tag that read, D. Hey, I said as she refilled my coffee. Can I ask you something? What do you know about Whispering Pines? Her hand froze for just a second before she resumed pouring. Why do you ask? We just moved out there, I said. To the old cabin on the McAllister place, she interrupted, her lips tightening. Figured as much. You don't look like locals. I ignored the jab. So, what's the deal with the place? Is there, I don't know, some local legend about it? Dee hesitated, glancing around like she didn't want to be overheard. Finally, she leaned in and said, You ever hear of the Pine People? I blinked. The what? She straightened up, looking uncomfortable. Most folks don't talk about it anymore. But if you're out there, you need to know. The forest, it's not like other places. It doesn't want to be disturbed. You've got to respect it, or, she trailed off, shaking her head. Or what? I pressed. She didn't answer. Instead, she turned and walked away, leaving me more confused than before. On the way home, I told Claire what Dee had said. She rolled her eyes so hard I thought they might get stuck. Seriously? Pine people? Come on, Mark. It's folklore. Small towns always have stories like that. Yeah, but what if? No, she said firmly. I'm not letting some diner ghost story freak me out. The kids need us to stay grounded. Okay? I nodded, but my unease only deepened when we got back to the cabin. The stick stars were gone. I'm not kidding. Every single one of them had vanished from the yard. At first, I thought maybe the wind had blown them away, but there wasn't any wind. The yard was undisturbed, and the stars weren't just scattered, they were gone. I checked the entire perimeter and found nothing. That night, the whispers returned. I stayed up late, sitting by the window with a cup of coffee, trying to figure out what the hell was going on. The forest outside was still and silent, but the whispers were unmistakable. They didn't seem to come from any one direction. It was like the whole forest was murmuring at once. The sound was faint, just on the edge of perception, but it made my skin crawl. And then, for the first time, I heard something clear, a single word. Leave. It was low, almost guttural, and it didn't sound like it came from a person. I shot out of my chair, my heart hammering in my chest, and stared out the window. The pines swayed softly in the breeze, but there was no one there. I didn't sleep that night. I don't think I even blinked. After that night, I couldn't shake the voice. It played on a loop in my head. Leave. Simple, direct, but with a weight to it that made my insides churn. I didn't tell Claire about it. Not yet. She was already convinced I was jumping at shadows, and the last thing I wanted was to give her more reasons to roll her eyes at me. Still, something had to give. The whispers, the footprints, the carvings. It was adding up to something I didn't understand. The next morning, I went back to the tree where Ellie had seen the face. I wasn't alone. Josh, my 11-year-old, insisted on tagging along. "What are we looking for, Dad?" he asked, trudging through the frost-covered grass. "Just checking out something Ellie saw," I said, trying to keep it casual. When we got to the tree, my stomach dropped. The face was still there, but it wasn't subtle anymore. The carving had deepened overnight, as if someone, or something, had been working on it while we slept. The mouth was wider now, the hollow eyes darker, and the texture of the bark around it looked unnatural, almost like skin. Josh stared at it, his brow furrowing. "That's creepy," he said. "Did Ellie do that?" "No," I said quickly. "She wouldn't know how. Let's head back." "Wait." Josh knelt at the base of the tree, brushing aside some dead leaves. When he stood up, he was holding another stick star, this one much smaller than the others. The twine that held it together was damp and dark, like it had been soaked in something. I took it from him and turned it over in my hands, my pulse quickening. "Where did you find this?" "It was just there," he said. "You think someone's messing with us?" "Maybe," I lied. "Come on, we're going back to the cabin." When we got inside, I pulled Claire aside and showed her the star. "This is getting out of hand," I said. "The carvings, the whispers, this thing. Someone's trying to scare us." "Mark," she said, her voice level, "you're scaring yourself? Look, I'll admit the carvings are weird, but this?" She held up the stick star. "It's just a piece of junk. You're reading too much into it. What about the footprints? The whispers at night?" I asked, my frustration boiling over. "You said yourself, this place is isolated. It's probably animals, or the wind, or," she trailed off, shaking her head. "I don't know, but it's not some backwoods boogeyman, okay?" I wanted to believe her, but my gut told me otherwise. That night, things escalated. We were in the middle of dinner. Claire had made stew, and the kids were actually getting along for once. When the generator cut out, the lights flickered and died, plunging us into darkness. "Damn it," I muttered, grabbing a flashlight. "Stay here. I'll check it out." I made my way to the shed, the beam of the flashlight cutting through the pitch-black night. The air was colder than usual, and the forest was deathly quiet. No wind, no crickets, nothing. When I reached the generator, it looked fine. No leaks, no loose wires. But just as I leaned in to inspect it, I heard the sound. A low, guttural whisper, coming from the trees behind me. "Leave." I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Slowly, I turned the flashlight toward the forest, the beam shaking in my trembling hand. The light swept over the trees, revealing nothing but trunks and shadows. But then I saw them. Eyes. Dozens of them, glowing faintly in the darkness, high up in the pines. They were small, almost like animal eyes, but they blinked in unison, as if they were all part of a single entity. I backed away slowly, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, overlapping into a cacophony that made my head spin. Leave, leave, leave. I turned and ran, the flashlight bouncing wildly as I stumbled back to the cabin. When I burst through the door, Claire and the kids jumped. What happened? Claire asked, her face pale. Nothing, I lied, slamming the door behind me. Generator's fine. It'll come back on soon. But I couldn't shake the feeling that those eyes were still watching us. The generator came back on an hour later, just like I said it would. I pretended everything was fine, but that night, I kept watch by the window again. The whispers returned, louder this time, and with them came movement. I saw the trees swaying, even though there was no wind. Shadows darted between the trunks, too fast to be animals. At one point, I thought I saw a figure standing at the edge of the yard, just barely visible in the moonlight. But when I blinked, it was gone. And then the whispers stopped, all at once. The silence was so sudden it felt deafening. For a moment, I thought it was over. But then I heard the sound of the front door creaking open. The sound of the door creaking open sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. My first thought was that one of the kids had gotten up, but when I turned toward the hallway, the bedrooms were dark and the cabin was silent. Too silent. I grabbed the fire poker from the hearth. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing, and crept toward the front door. My heart was pounding so loudly I thought it might give me away. The door was ajar, swinging slightly on its hinges, the cold night air leaking in. I nudged it open further with the poker, shining my flashlight into the yard. Nothing. Just the trees, still and ominous, their tall forms almost blending into the night sky. The porch was empty, but the hairs on the back of my neck were standing up, screaming that I wasn't alone. Then I saw it. At the edge of the yard, standing half hidden behind a tree, was a figure. At first, I thought it was a person, but the proportions were wrong. It was tall, too tall, and its limbs were thin, like branches. Its head tilted slightly to one side as if it were studying me, and in the weak glow of my flashlight, I could see faint ridges on its skin, like bark. The whispers started again, low and insistent. They didn't seem to come from the figure, but from the forest around it. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the flashlight. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice cracking. The figure didn't move. For a moment, I thought I could convince myself it was just a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the trees. But then it shifted, stepping forward into the yard. Its movements were slow and deliberate, almost like it was testing the air. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The whispers grew louder, pressing against the walls of the cabin, until I thought I'd lose my mind. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the door with the poker in hand, my ears straining for any sign of movement. But the whispers eventually faded, and the rest of the night passed without incident. When the sun finally rose, it felt like I'd aged a decade. At breakfast, Claire noticed my pallor. "You look awful," she said, handing me a cup of coffee. "Did you even sleep?" I shook my head, not trusting myself to speak. Josh and Ellie were too busy arguing over the last pancake to notice my unease, but Claire wasn't buying it. She waited until the kids ran outside to play before cornering me in the kitchen. "Okay, what's going on?" she demanded. "You've been on edge for days, and now you're jumping at shadows. Did something happen last night?" I hesitated. Telling her about the figure felt like crossing a line, like admitting it was real, but I couldn't keep it bottled up anymore. I told her everything, the whispers, the carvings, the stick stars, the eyes in the trees, and finally, the figure in the yard. Claire stared at me, her face a mix of concern and disbelief. "Mark," she said carefully, "do you think, could it just be stress? Maybe you're seeing things because you're not sleeping." Stress didn't carve faces into the trees or leave footprints in the snow. I snapped, more harshly than I intended. I know what I saw. She held up her hands. Okay, okay. Let's not freak the kids out, though, all right? I'll keep an eye out, but I think you need a break. A break. Sure. From what? Reality. That afternoon, I decided to check the attic. I'd been avoiding it since we moved in, mostly because the door was jammed. But something about the figure in the yard made me feel like I needed answers. Maybe the previous owners had left something up there. Old photos, journals, anything that could explain what was happening. It took some elbow grease, but I finally forced the door open. A gust of stale air greeted me, carrying with it the smell of mildew and something faintly metallic. I climbed the ladder, my flashlight cutting through the gloom. The attic was small and cluttered with forgotten junk. Broken furniture, old trunks, and stacks of newspapers that crumbled at the edges when I touched them. At first, I thought it was a dead end, just a storage space for someone else's trash. But then I saw the drawings. They were on the far wall, etched directly into the wood. Dozens of crude shapes, all scratched in the same jagged style. They depicted figures, tall, spindly ones with long limbs and hollow eyes. Some were shown standing among trees, while others loomed over smaller figures that I assumed were supposed to be people. My stomach churned as I noticed one recurring image, a stick star, etched over and over again, sometimes surrounding the tall figures, sometimes forming a circle around the smaller ones. In one particularly large drawing, the star was drawn inside a house. Our house. I climbed down from the attic, my legs trembling. I didn't tell Claire what I'd found, but I couldn't hide the look on my face. She tried to get me to talk, but I brushed her off and went outside to check on the kids. Ellie was playing near the edge of the woods again, and my chest tightened. Ellie, stay away from there, I called, more sharply than I intended. She turned and waved, but she didn't come any closer. Daddy, they're watching, she said, pointing toward the trees. Who's watching? I asked, my heart racing. The tree people, she said matter-of-factly. They don't like us. When Ellie said, the tree people don't like us, something in her voice made my stomach drop. It wasn't fear, it was certainty. Like she knew something I didn't, and the realization terrified me more than anything else I'd seen so far. I forced a smile and called her over. Ellie, come here, sweetheart. What are you talking about? She hesitated, glancing back toward the woods before skipping over to me. She looked so innocent, holding a handful of pine cones like she hadn't just dropped a bombshell. They don't like it when we're loud, she said simply, or when we break things. You're not supposed to break the trees. Who told you that? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Ellie shrugged. They did. She looked up at me with those big, serious eyes, and for a moment, I didn't know what to say. Before I could press her further, Josh came running up, oblivious to the tension. Dad, can we build a fort? There's a perfect spot over there by the rocks. Sure, I said distractedly, ruffling his hair. Just stay where I can see you, okay? Josh groaned but nodded, dragging Ellie along with him. I watched them for a long time, my eyes darting to the woods every few seconds, half expecting one of the tree people to step out and make good on Ellie's warning. Nothing happened. Not yet, anyway. That evening, Claire caught me staring out the window. My jaw clenched so tight it hurt. You're going to make yourself sick if you keep this up, she said, sitting down next to me. I'm telling you, there's something wrong with this place, I said. Ellie's talking about tree people. Josh is finding those damn stick stars and the carvings. Mark. She cut me off, her tone firm but kind. Listen to yourself. You're spiraling. The kids are just being kids, and you're letting this, whatever this is, mess with your head. I opened my mouth to argue, but before I could, a loud crash from the living room made both of us jump. We rushed in to find one of the shelves toppled over, books and picture frames scattered across the floor. The kids came running down the stairs, their eyes wide. What happened? Claire asked, her voice sharp with a mix of fear and irritation. I don't know, I said, picking up a shattered frame. Maybe the nails were loose? But even as I said it, I knew that wasn't true. The shelf hadn't fallen. It had been shoved hard. Ellie pointed at the window. They're mad. Claire shot me a look that screamed, stop feeding into this. Before turning to Ellie, honey, it was just an accident. Go back upstairs, okay? We'll clean this up. Ellie didn't argue, but as she and Josh trudged back to their rooms, I heard her whisper to him, they're always watching. That night, I barricaded the doors and windows. I didn't care if Claire thought I was overreacting. Something was out there, and I wasn't taking any chances. I stayed up again, the fire poker by my side, listening for the whispers. They came, right on schedule. But this time, they were louder. Closer. Leave, they hissed. You don't belong. I gripped the poker so tightly my knuckles ached. What do you want? I whispered, not expecting an answer. For a moment, the whispers stopped. Then, faintly, a single word emerged from the cacophony. Balance. The next morning, I decided to go back into town. Claire tried to stop me, insisting I was letting my paranoia get the better of me, but I wouldn't budge. I needed answers. At the diner, I cornered Dee, the waitress who'd mentioned the Pine people before. She looked even more reluctant to talk this time, glancing around like someone might be listening. Please, I said. I need to know what's going on. My kids, my family could be in danger. Dee sighed, rubbing her temples. All right, she said, lowering her voice. I'll tell you what I know, but you're not gonna like it. She leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper. The forest doesn't belong to us. It never did. It belongs to them. Who? I asked, my pulse quickening. She hesitated before answering. The Pine people. They're not spirits, and they're not animals. They're something else. They keep the forest in balance. If you respect it, they leave you alone. But if you break that balance, she trailed off, shaking her head. I swallowed hard. What does that mean? How do we break the balance? Cutting down trees, leaving trash, making too much noise, basically acting like city folk who think they own the place, she said, her tone blunt. They don't take kindly to that. I thought about Ellie's words, you're not supposed to break the trees. A cold knot formed in my stomach. Has anyone ever? I hesitated, then forced the words out. Has anyone ever disappeared? Dee didn't answer, but the look on her face was enough. When I got back to the cabin, Claire was furious. You can't just run off like that, she said, arms crossed. The kids were scared, Mark. You're scaring me. I'm trying to keep us safe, I said, my voice rising. From what? Your imagination? I didn't answer. Instead, I went outside to clear my head. The forest loomed around the cabin, dark and impenetrable, and for the first time, I felt like it was watching me as much as I was watching it. That's when I noticed the stick stars. They were back, scattered around the yard in a perfect circle, and this time, there were more of them. Dozens, maybe hundreds, all arranged with eerie precision. I stood there, frozen, as the whispers began to creep in, soft and insistent. Balance. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the stick stars scattered across the yard. It felt like my brain was short-circuiting, refusing to process what I was seeing. The arrangement wasn't random. It was too perfect, too deliberate. A boundary. A warning. The whispers started again, weaving through the cold air, brushing against my ears like fingertips. Balance, they said, the word low and guttural, almost like a growl. Balance. I took a step back, my foot crunching on frost-covered grass. The sound broke my trance, and I stumbled inside, slamming the door behind me. Claire turned from where she was folding laundry in the living room, her expression shifting from annoyance to alarm. What is it now? She asked, crossing her arms. Come look, I said, motioning her toward the window. She hesitated, then followed me. When I pulled back the curtain, she gasped. What the hell? I don't know, I said, running a hand through my hair. They weren't there this morning. I checked. Who's doing this? She asked, her voice shaking. I don't think it's a who, I said. Claire gave me a sharp look, her eyes narrowing. You can't seriously think? Look at them, Claire. I snapped, pointing at the stars. Do you think a person could make something like that in an hour, without leaving footprints? This isn't normal. She opened her mouth to argue, but the words didn't come. Instead, she turned away and muttered, "We need to get out of here." That night, I couldn't sleep again. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening for the whispers. They didn't come, but the silence was almost worse. It was heavy, oppressive, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I felt like we were being suffocated. Around 2 a.m., I heard a noise downstairs. A creak, then another, like someone, or something, was walking through the living room. I grabbed the fire poker again and crept down the stairs, my heart hammering in my chest. The living room was empty, but the front door was open. Wide open. I swore under my breath and stepped onto the porch. The yard was bathed in pale moonlight, and the stick stars glinted faintly in the frost. My breath fogged the air as I scanned the tree line, half expecting to see the figure from the other night. But the yard was empty. I was about to head back inside when I noticed something new. In the middle of the circle of stars, there was an object, small, dark, and oddly shaped. I stepped down the porch stairs, the cold biting through my socks, and approached it cautiously. The object was a bundle of twigs wrapped in what looked like animal hide, tied with more of that damp, dark twine. It smelled faintly of decay. I crouched down, hesitant to touch it, but before I could get a better look, the whispers returned. This time, they weren't distant. They were right behind me. Balance. I whipped around, but there was nothing there. Just the empty yard and the swaying pines. My pulse was racing, and I bolted back inside, slamming the door behind me. The next morning, I woke up to shouting. Claire and Josh were arguing in the kitchen, their voices echoing through the cabin. I stumbled downstairs, groggy and on edge. "What's going on?" I asked, rubbing my temples. "Tell your son to stop breaking things," Claire snapped, pointing at Josh, who was standing by the back door with his arms crossed. "I didn't break anything," Josh shot back. "It was already like that." "What's broken?" I asked, looking between them. Claire held up a ceramic mug, or what was left of it. The handle was snapped clean off, and there was a jagged crack running down the middle. "I found this in the sink. It's one of the only mugs that survived the move, and now it's ruined." "It wasn't me," Josh said again, his face red. "Maybe it just cracked on its own," I said, trying to defuse the situation. Claire shook her head. "Things don't just break themselves, Mark." Ellie wandered into the kitchen, yawning. She looked at the mug, then at Claire. "They don't like it when you break things," she said softly. The room went dead silent. "What did you say, Ellie?" I asked, kneeling down to her level. "The tree people," she said. "They don't like it when we break stuff. They get mad." Claire shot me a look that said, "This is your fault," but I ignored her. "Ellie," I said gently, "did they tell you that?" She nodded, her eyes wide. "They don't talk like us, though. They talk in the trees." After breakfast, I went outside to look for the bundle again, but it was gone. The stick stars were still there, but the strange object in the center had vanished, leaving behind nothing but a faint patch of disturbed grass. I didn't know what to make of it, but I knew one thing for sure. Whatever was happening here wasn't just in my head. That night, we made a decision. We were leaving. Claire and I stayed up late packing, while the kids slept upstairs. Stepped outside, the cool night air biting at my skin. The pine people emerged from the shadows, their hollow eyes glowing faintly. There were more of them this time. Dozens, maybe more, surrounding the house in a loose circle. Their spindly limbs moved in eerie unison, their bark-like faces twisted into expressions I couldn't read. The tallest one stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate. It raised one long arm and pointed at me. "Decide," it said. "I'll go," I said, my voice shaking but steady. "Let my family go and I'll stay." The whispers stilled for a moment, and the tall figure tilted its head as if considering my offer. Then it spoke again. "One must stay. Balance will be restored." I dropped the fire poker, my hands trembling. "Take me." Claire burst out of the house, the kids trailing behind her. "No," she screamed. "You don't have to do this. Go back inside." I yelled, panic flooding my chest. "We're not leaving without you," she said, grabbing my arm. If they want balance, then we'll find another way. Together, the pine people moved closer, their forms shifting in the shadows. The whispers returned, louder than before, and the tallest figure stepped even closer. You cannot leave, it said. The balance is broken. One must stay. I pushed Claire and the kids behind me, my pulse racing. I said I'll go. Just leave them alone. The tall figure tilted its head again, its hollow eyes locking onto mine. You cannot choose for the forest. What does that mean? I demanded, my voice cracking. The whispers swelled, drowning out my thoughts. And then, all at once, they stopped. The pine people stepped back, their movements slow and deliberate, until they melted into the shadows of the forest. I turned to Claire, confused. What just happened? Before she could answer, Ellie gasped, pointing toward the house. I spun around and felt my heart drop. The doorway was empty. Josh was gone. Josh! Claire screamed, her voice breaking as she bolted toward the house. I grabbed Ellie, holding her close as she sobbed into my chest, her tiny hands clutching my shirt. Josh! Claire yelled again, disappearing inside. My legs felt like lead, but I forced myself to follow her, praying that somehow he was just hiding, that the pine people hadn't taken him. The house was silent, too silent. I searched every room, throwing open doors and looking under beds, but Josh was nowhere to be found. His coat and shoes were still by the front door. The pine people had taken him. Claire collapsed in the living room, sobbing into her hands. Why him? She choked out. Why didn't they take one of us? They don't care who it is, I said, my voice hollow. They just wanted someone. Ellie stood in the corner, hugging her stuffed rabbit, her face pale and tear-streaked. They're going to keep him, she whispered. He's the balance now. No, I said firmly, kneeling in front of her. We're getting him back. Claire looked up at me, her eyes red and puffy. How? You saw what they can do. We can't fight them. I'm not giving up on my son, I said, standing. I don't care what it takes. We're getting him back. I grabbed the fire poker and a flashlight, then turned to Claire. Stay here with Ellie. Lock the doors and don't open them for anyone. You're not going out there alone, she said, her voice trembling but defiant. If you're going, I'm coming too. I wanted to argue, but I knew better. Claire wouldn't let me face this alone, and honestly, I wasn't sure I could. Fine, I said, but stay close to me. If anything happens, you run. She nodded, grabbing a kitchen knife. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. I kissed Ellie's forehead, whispering, I'll bring him back. She didn't respond, just clung to her rabbit and stared at me with wide, tearful eyes. The forest was alive when we stepped outside. The pines swayed in the windless night, their branches creaking like old wood. The whispers started immediately, faint and chaotic, coming from every direction. Balance, they said. Stay. One must stay. Claire gripped my arm as we moved deeper into the woods, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, but it felt useless against the weight of the shadows around us. Josh, I called, my voice echoing through the trees. Josh, where are you? The forest seemed to respond. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and the trees themselves seemed to shift, their trunks closing in around us like they were alive. And then we heard it, a faint cry, distant but unmistakable. Dad! Mom! Claire gasped, her grip tightening on my arm. That's him. We broke into a run, following the sound as it echoed through the forest. The trees seemed to move with us, their limbs reaching out like claws, but we didn't stop. Josh's voice grew louder, closer, until we burst into a small clearing. He was there. Josh stood in the center of the clearing, his face pale and his eyes wide with fear. But he wasn't alone. The pine people surrounded him, their tall, spindly forms blending with the shadows. The tallest one stood behind him, its long limbs outstretched like it was claiming him. Josh! Claire screamed, taking a step forward, but the whispers erupted, deafening and overlapping, freezing her in her tracks. Balance, the tall figure said, its hollow eyes glowing faintly. One must stay. I raised the fire poker, my hands trembling. Take me instead, I said. Let him go. The tall figure tilted its head, its bark-like face unreadable. You cannot choose for the forest, it said, its voice low and rumbling. Then what do you want? I yelled. Tell me what you want. The whispers swelled again, chaotic and overwhelming, before abruptly stopping. The tall figure stepped closer, its hollow eyes fixed on me. The forest has chosen, it said. The boy stays. No, Claire screamed, rushing forward. But one of the pine people moved to block her path, its limbs creaking as it reached out toward her. I swung the fire poker, the metal colliding with the figure's arm. It shattered like brittle wood, splinters flying in every direction. The creature recoiled, its form flickering like a glitch in reality, but it didn't fall. Run, I yelled, grabbing Claire's arm and pulling her back. We can't fight them. I'm not leaving him, she screamed, tears streaming down her face. Josh looked at us, his eyes pleading. Dad, please, he said, his voice breaking. Don't let them take me. I stepped forward, my heart pounding. Take me instead, I said again, my voice shaking. Please. The tall figure stared at me, its hollow eyes unblinking. For a moment, I thought it would listen, but then it raised one long arm and pointed at Josh. The balance is restored, it said. Josh screamed as the pine people closed in, their spindly limbs wrapping around him. Claire lunged forward, but I held her back, my heart shattering as his cries echoed through the forest. And then, just as quickly as they had appeared, they were gone. Josh was gone. The forest fell silent. We stood in the clearing for what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. The forest was eerily silent, the whispers gone. The pine people vanished. It was like they'd never been there at all. But Josh was gone, and the emptiness he left behind hit me like a physical weight. Claire collapsed to her knees, sobbing uncontrollably. They took him, she choked out. They took my baby. I dropped the fire poker, my hands trembling. I wanted to say something, anything, that might comfort her, but there were no words. How could I make sense of what had just happened when I couldn't even wrap my own head around it? Ellie's voice echoed in my mind. They don't want things. They want one of us. The pine people had gotten what they wanted. The balance was restored. But it wasn't over. I could feel it in my bones. We stumbled back to the house in a daze, the weight of our loss pressing down on us like a lead blanket. Claire barely spoke, her eyes red and swollen, her hands shaking. Ellie sat silently on the couch, clutching her stuffed rabbit, her face pale and unreadable. She hadn't said a word since we returned, and I was too drained to press her. I spent the rest of the night pacing the house, unable to sit still. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind outside sent my heart racing. The whispers were gone, but the forest wasn't done with us. I could feel it watching, waiting. Around 3 a.m., I finally collapsed onto the couch, my head in my hands. That's when I heard Ellie's voice, soft and trembling. Daddy, she said. I looked up to see her standing in the doorway, clutching her rabbit. What is it, sweetheart? They're not done, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I tried to brush it off as a nightmare, but the look in her eyes told me otherwise. She wasn't afraid, she was certain, and she was right. The next morning, I went back to the clearing where we'd lost Josh. I didn't tell Claire. She wouldn't have let me go, and I couldn't sit around doing nothing. The forest felt different now, heavier somehow, like it was alive and aware of my presence. When I reached the clearing, my stomach dropped. In the center, where Josh had stood the night before, was a new carving. It was a face, etched deep into the bark of a massive pine tree. The features were unmistakable. Josh's wide eyes, his parted lips, frozen in an expression of fear. My knees buckled, and I fell to the ground, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The pine people hadn't just taken him. They'd made him part of the forest. I stumbled back to the house, shaking uncontrollably. Claire was in the kitchen, staring blankly at a cup of untouched coffee. When she saw me, her expression hardened. What did you do? She asked, her voice cold. What are you talking about? I asked, confused. You went back out there, she said. I saw you. What were you hoping to accomplish? I didn't answer. I couldn't bring myself to tell her about the carving. She didn't need that image burned into her mind like it was in mine. You have to let him go, she said, her voice breaking. He's gone, Mark. He's gone. I wanted to argue, to tell her that I could still fix this, but the words caught in my throat. Deep down, I knew she was right. Josh was gone, and there was no bringing him back. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat by the window, staring out at the dark yard, listening for the whispers that no longer came. The forest was quiet now, its balance restored, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. Around midnight, Ellie came downstairs and climbed into my lap. She didn't say anything, just curled up against me and stared out the window with the same haunted look in her eyes. They're watching, she said after a long silence. Who? I asked, though I already knew the answer. The tree people, she said. They're making sure we don't break the rules again. I wrapped my arms around her, holding her close. I wanted to tell her that everything was going to be okay, but I couldn't. I didn't believe it myself. The next morning, Claire packed our bags. We're leaving, she said, her voice resolute. Where will we go? I asked. Anywhere but here, she said. I don't care if we have to live in a motel for the rest of our lives. We're not staying. I didn't argue. There was nothing left for us here. The Pine people had taken Josh, and the house would never feel like home again. But as we loaded the car, I couldn't shake the feeling that leaving wouldn't be enough. The Pine people weren't tied to the forest. They were tied to us. And no matter where we went, they would follow. As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a moment, I thought I saw something. A tall, spindly figure standing at the edge of the woods, its hollow eyes watching us go. And then it was gone. We left Whispering Pines that morning, driving for hours without stopping. Claire sat stiffly in the passenger seat, staring out the window with a vacant expression. Ellie sat in the back, silent, her stuffed rabbit clutched tightly in her arms. None of us spoke, but as the miles stretched behind us, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't really leaving. The Pine people had already claimed part of us, part of our family, and they weren't done. We settled in a small, run-down motel on the outskirts of another nowhere town. It wasn't ideal, but Claire didn't care, and I didn't have the energy to argue. I spent my days trying to look normal, helping Claire find us a permanent place to stay. But at night, I sat by the window, staring out at the dark streets, waiting for them to come. Ellie stopped eating. She stopped sleeping. When I tried to talk to her, she just shook her head and said, "They're still watching." Claire wanted to take her to a doctor, but I knew it wouldn't help. What Ellie was seeing wasn't something a prescription could fix. One night, I woke to find Ellie standing by the motel room door. She was holding her rabbit, staring at the handle as if she were waiting for someone to open it. "Ellie," I whispered, sitting up, "what are you doing?" "They're calling me," she said, her voice eerily calm. I jumped out of bed and pulled her into my arms. "No, they're not. They can't hurt you anymore." She looked up at me, her eyes filled with tears. "They don't want to hurt me. They want me to bring him back." "Josh?" I asked, my voice breaking. Ellie nodded. "They said I can fix it. If I go to the forest, I can bring him back." The next day, I packed a bag. Claire begged me not to go, but I couldn't sit around waiting for the Pine people to take another part of my family. "I'm not letting Ellie go back there," I said, "and I'm not letting them win." "You think you can fight them?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Mark, they're not human. They don't play by our rules." "I have to try," I said. "For Josh. For Ellie. For all of us." She didn't say anything else. She just turned away, tears streaming down her face. I drove back to the forest alone. The closer I got, the heavier the air became, like the forest itself was alive and waiting for me. By the time I reached the cabin, the whispers had already started. "Balance," they hissed. "Restore." I stepped out of the car, gripping the fire poker tightly. "I'm here." I yelled into the trees. "You wanted me? Take me. Let him go." The whispers grew louder, overlapping and chaotic, until the trees seemed to vibrate with their intensity. The Pine people emerged from the shadows, their spindly forms blending with the trees. The tallest one stepped forward, its hollow eyes fixed on me. "You cannot fix what is broken," it said, its voice a low rumble. "Then what do you want?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Tell me how to make this right." The figure tilted its head, its bark-like face unreadable. "The balance is restored. The boy is ours." "No," I screamed, swinging the fire poker at the figure. The metal passed through it like smoke, and the whispers erupted into mocking laughter. "Return," the figure said, "or more will stay." I fell to my knees, defeated. The Pine People weren't going to give Josh back, no matter what I did. And if I stayed, they would take me too, or worse, they'd come for Ellie. But then, the whispers stilled. The tall figure leaned closer, its hollow eyes inches from my face. "Blood restores," it said. "A life for a life." I froze, the words echoing in my mind. A life for a life. They were offering me a trade. "Take me," I said, my voice trembling. "Take me instead." The figure didn't move. "The forest chooses." Before I could ask what that meant, the whispers returned, louder than ever. The Pine People dissolved into the shadows, leaving me alone in the clearing. When I got back to the motel, Ellie was waiting for me. She didn't say anything, just hugged me tightly. Claire didn't ask what had happened. She already knew. That night, I woke to find Ellie gone. The motel room door was wide open, and her stuffed rabbit lay abandoned on the floor. I ran outside, calling her name, but the street was empty. In the distance, I thought I heard whispers. "Balance." I never saw Ellie again. The Pine People had taken her, just like they'd taken Josh. The balance was restored, but at what cost? Claire and I left town the next day, and we haven't stopped moving since. But no matter where we go, I can still feel the forest watching, waiting. The Pine People don't forget, and they don't forgive. The end. Thanks for sticking with me through this. Writing it all out feels like the only way to make sense of it, though I'm not sure I ever really will. If you're ever near a forest, remember this. The trees are older than us. Respect them, because if you don't, they'll remind you who they really belong to.